On the morning of January 13th, 2010, two twin girls nicknamed Tas and Jas stood at the kitchen counter in their home in Conyers, Georgia, writing notes back and forth to each other inside of a little notebook, laughing the whole time. The girls were late for school and they knew it, and so they were writing their messages back and forth instead of talking because they didn't want to wake their mom up and get yelled at for being late. Eventually, they finished their notes, closed the notebook, then began getting ready to leave. When they would return home from school that afternoon, they would find their quiet home in the gated community in Georgia soaked with blood and unspeakable horror waiting for them in the master bathroom. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please hide a Bluetooth speaker in the follow button's bedroom that plays cricket noises all night long. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of January 9th, 2010, third eye for year-old Jarmika Whitehead, whose friends all called her Nikki, spooned coleslaw onto a platter and watched as guests began to filter into her home, which was located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a gated community. Standing by the front door greeting the guests were Nikki's 16-year-old twin daughters, Jas and Tas. Nikki had been nervous about hosting this party tonight, but so far everything was going well. She'd made a fish fry and her whole family had come and brought even more food. She had worked all day at the hair salon where she was a beautician, but she'd still had some time to decorate and hang up handwritten posters that read Tas and Jas welcome home. We love you. Now, Tas was here laughing it up with her family, and it made Nikki really happy. But as she looked around, she realized that Jas was nowhere to be seen. Nikki frowned. This party was really supposed to be a celebration of forgiveness and new beginnings, but there was still a lot of hurt to get over in their little family. Because for the last year and a half, Tas and Jas had not been living at home with Nikki. Nikki had lost custody of her kids after the three of them got into a huge fight and Nikki called the police. She had thought that calling the police would just scare the girls into behaving better, but that's not what happened. Instead, a judge decided that Nikki was not a fit parent and sent the girls to go live with Nikki's grandmother, Della Frazier. Nikki had been heartbroken. She herself had come from a tough background, and she had tried so hard to break the cycle for her kids. She had actually been raised by Della, who was her grandmother and so her daughter's great-grandmother, because when she was born, her own mom was in jail. And also, Nikki had gotten pregnant with the twin girls when she was just 18 years old. But when the girls were born, Nikki had decided that she would not let them make the same mistakes that she had. Instead, Nikki had tried to raise them with strict rules and to focus on academics. And so Tas and Jas became Girl Scouts. They did dance and music classes, and they made the honor roll at school until they became teenagers. Everyone always said how sweet and well-behaved they were, but when they hit 13 years old, they began sneaking out and getting into fights, and nothing Nikki did seemed to rein them in. When Nikki finally lost custody of her kids to her grandmother Della, she had worried she might never get her girls back. But she had done a lot of hard work, including enrolling in college classes, and finally she had regained custody and her girls were home, living with her and her boyfriend, Robert Head. Now, everything was not perfect at this point. The girls were very clingy to each other, and they openly said they missed Della, their great-grandmother. But for tonight, Nikki felt like on the whole things were pretty good, except that one of the girls, Jas, seemed to have disappeared from the party already. Nikki went and found her best friend and asked her to go look for Jas. Her friend nodded and then slipped away, and Nikki waited nervously by the food for her friend to come back. And only a few minutes later, the friend returned with some good news. She said that Jas was in her bedroom and was a bit overwhelmed by everything, but they had had a nice conversation about how excited everybody was to have them home. Nikki's friend said that both the girls seemed to be in good spirits, so Nikki should just relax and eat and enjoy the party. At this, Nikki felt a wave of relief wash over her. Then she went back to setting up the fish fry. 3 nights later, on January 12th at about 10:30 p.m., Nikki walked out of her evening class at the local college, where she was studying to be a fashion designer, and got into her car. It had been a bad day. All the happiness she had felt at the girls' welcome home party was now gone. But this time it was not because of a fight she had had with the girls. Instead, it was because she and her boyfriend Robert had had a nasty argument that afternoon. Nikki and Robert had been together for a decade, and they really loved each other, but their relationship was a little unconventional. Part of it was that Robert was 30 years older than Nikki and he worked as a long-haul trucker. So he was away from home for days or even weeks at a time. But none of that is what made their relationship truly unusual. What made it really atypical was that their relationship was open, meaning Nikki was allowed to have other boyfriends besides Robert. And this was ultimately what their fight that day had been about. According to the rules they had set up for their relationship, when Robert was home, they were an exclusive couple, but when Robert was away working, Nikki could date anybody she wanted. But Nikki was not supposed to talk to Robert about her other boyfriends. But this morning, she had taken a call from a man named Joe Carter, who she was dating, right in front of Robert, and Robert had been furious and insulted. And Nikki had left to come to class without resolving that fight. Now, all she really wanted to do was go home and relax and just be by herself. And she knew Robert had left on a trucking trip and the girls were very likely asleep right now. But she couldn't just go home and do that because the reason her other boyfriend, Joe Carter, had called her that morning was to ask her to come over to his house after her class. So Nikki shook off her exhaustion and drove to Joe's house and rang the bell, hoping that whatever Joe wanted, it would be quick. When Joe entered the door, he looked very serious. He invited Nikki inside, but he seemed incredibly tense and awkward. Nikki had a bad feeling and she asked Joe what was wrong, but at first he wouldn't even answer her directly. He just kept talking about old fights they'd had. Nikki had already had a long and emotionally draining day, so she told Joe that whatever was on his mind, he just needed to spit it out. So Joe told her he wanted to break up. He was done being part of her open relationship. Nikki was absolutely incredulous. Joe had made her come all the way out here late at night after class, after all this, just to break up with her. And also just weeks after her daughters had finally come home. Like this is supposed to be a good time in her life and he's just crushing her. Nikki just stormed out of Joe's apartment and slammed the door behind her. The next day, January 13th, a little before 3:30 p.m., Nikki's twin daughters, Tas and Jas, got home from school. They walked down Appaloosa Way and turned into the walkway of their home. When they got to the door, Jas took out her keys and unlocked it. She pushed the door open and stepped in ahead of Tas. And as Jas did this, she began to scream because the entire entryway was covered with blood. There was a trail of it leading into the house. They screamed out for their mother, but they got no answer. And so, perhaps against their better judgment, they decided to go and uncheck on her. And so they followed the trail of blood that brought them all the way to the master bedroom. And when they looked into the master bathroom, they just stood there in silence before turning and bolting out of the house. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy was driving his cruiser down Appaloosa Way on his way back to the station after serving a warrant at one of the houses in the Hewa neighborhood when he saw two teenage girls sprinting towards his car at full speed. The deputy slammed on his brakes as the girls reached his cruiser and began banging on the windows. They were completely hysterical and screaming incoherently, and when the deputy got out of his cruiser, it took him a second to get them to calm down enough to tell him what was going on. But when they finally did, he radioed back to the station to request backup. About 30 minutes later, around 4 p.m., Detective Ken Swift of the Conyers Police Department stood inside the master bathroom of Nikki Whitehead's home on Appaloosa Way, looking down at Nikki's dead body, partially submerged under the water in the jacuzzi-style tub above. This was the bloodiest crime scene that Swift had ever been to. The whole house had a stifling, metallic smell from the sheer amount of blood that was soaked into the carpets and smeared all over the walls. Whatever had happened here, Swift could tell it had been long and very violent. The house was trashed. Chairs were tipped over. There were all these jagged pieces of something red and ceramic scattered in the living room, and the floor was littered with magazines that had been knocked off a coffee table. Now Swift tried to count the number of stab wounds on his victim's body, but it was impossible. This level of brutality suggested pure rage. which meant that Nikki had very likely known her killer. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or anything stolen also supported this theory. Swift put on a pair of gloves and then bent down to gently touch Nikki's head. He could see lots of stab wounds in the back in front of her neck, and there was a strand of hair between her teeth. Swift asked a crime scene tech to take the hair for analysis. Then he stood up and followed the bloody drag marks back out of the bathroom and down the hallway. He found a bloody handprint on a door frame of the master bedroom and also on the doorknob of the front door. There were some bloody footprints of bare feet that officers had discovered outside that suggested that someone, very likely Nikki, had actually run out of the house during the attack but had either turned around or, if it was Nikki, been dragged back inside. Swift stood at the front doorway looking out at those bloody footprints and also the sea of police vehicles with their flashing blue lights on. He was hopeful that a neighborhood canvass would turn up witnesses. This was, after all, a very safe and very quiet area. Someone running outside covered in blood was sure to attract attention. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes settled on two teenage girls standing on the front lawn with blankets draped over their backs. They were both visibly shaking with sobs and standing close together, and one of them had her arms up over her face. But as Swift watched, he realized that the girl with her arms up wasn't just crying. She was actually also biting her arm with a look of pure anguish on her face. Now, Swift knew these girls were the victims' daughters, and he also knew they were the ones who found the body. And so, based on what he was seeing, it seemed like they had to be in shock. He was about to walk over to them and offer some words of comfort when a police captain actually intercepted him and just let him know that he had already arranged for the girls to be transported to the station. And so, Swift decided he would talk to the girls there. About an hour later, Detective Swift was standing in the police station looking at a TV monitor that showed a live feed of the conference room where the captain had put Jas and Ta's Whitehead. The girls had calmed down a little bit, but they were still rocking back and forth and obviously crying. By now, the officers had finished canvassing Nikki Whitehead's neighborhood, and shockingly, no one had seen anything. One neighbor reported hearing his doorbell ring in the morning and someone yelling, but he hadn't gotten out of bed to answer it. The only potentially useful information the police had gotten from neighbors was that they had seen a black car they didn't recognize parked on the street near Nikki's house around the time of the murder. But this was not a lot to go on until they got forensics back. Swift knew that Tas and Jas Whitehead were his best hope for any leads. However, they were so distraught he didn't know what he would get out of an interview. But when Swift walked into the conference room, the girls appeared to try to pull themselves together, and Tas told Jas they had to be strong. Swift put a box of tissues on the table and then gently asked the girls if they could walk him through what had happened. The girls took a minute to compose themselves and then they began to speak. They told the detective that the day before, their mother had gotten into a bad argument with her boyfriend Robert, but they hadn't really resolved it, and then she had left for class and he had left for work. The girls said that night they stayed up late at their house, but they were in one of their bedrooms talking with each other. So when their mom came home, they didn't hear her. And then that morning, they had overslept and missed the bus, but they ended up walking to school because when they knocked on their mother's door, she didn't answer. The girls said at the time they hadn't thought much of it, and when they left the house, everything looked and seemed normal. They just hadn't seen their mom yet. But when they got home, of course, it had been a different story. The house was ransacked, there was blood everywhere, and when they tried to call out for their mother and she didn't call back, they wound up searching the house, and they would ultimately find her dead inside the tub. At this point, the girls began to break down and start crying again, like they were reliving the moment they found their mother. And to Swift, this made sense. But really, what he was thinking about was the part of the story where the girls referenced a fight between Nikki and her boyfriend Robert. The police have been trying to reach Robert ever since they found Nikki's body, but he was on the road in his semi-truck and they hadn't yet been able to track him down. And in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner was always the first suspect, especially when they were not getting along. And according to the girls, that's exactly what was happening right before Nikki had died. However, when Swift asked the girls if Robert and their mom fought often, Tas and Jas were adamant that they didn't. They said they loved Robert and so did their mom. Their biological father had not been in their lives, and Robert had really helped to raise them, taking them for rides in his truck and out to eat at McDonald's. He was great. So, Swift asked the twins if there was anybody else they could think of in their mother's life who maybe she wasn't getting along with, or who might have wanted to, do her harm. And it was at this point that Tas and Jas brought up Joe Carter. The girls said their mom did really love Robert, but she talked to a lot of other men. And the one name the girls have been hearing a lot recently was Joe Carter, who was their mother's other boyfriend. Now, the way Tas and Jas brought up this other boyfriend was very casual, like it was totally normal in their lives. But when Swift heard it, he immediately knew he had a compelling motive for Nikki's murder by either Robert or Joe, a love triangle. Detective Swift left the twins in the conference room and walked out of the police station to his cruiser. He couldn't question Nikki's primary boyfriend, Robert, until he could find him, but the twins had told him that Nikki's secondary boyfriend, Joe Carter, worked at a barbershop right next to Nikki's salon, and that was only about a 20-minute drive away from the station. Swift figured that if he hurried, he could catch Joe before his shop closed up for the day. He drove over, and when he stepped into the barbershop, a little bell on the door jingled. Everyone inside the shop reflexively glanced to see who would come in, and Swift cleared his throat and asked if Joe Carter was around. When one of the barbers gestured that was him, Swift asked him to step outside. Swift studied Joe's face carefully as he made this request, looking for any sign of nervousness, but Joe just looked confused. He told the customer whose hair he was cutting that he'd be right back and then followed Swift out onto the sidewalk. Once they were outside, Joe immediately took out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Swift, but Swift shook his head and said no. Joe seemed relaxed and friendly and like he had genuinely no idea why Swift might be there. So based on that, Swift decided to just be direct. He told Joe that he had some terrible news. His girlfriend Nikki Whitehead had been murdered that morning, and so he needed to know where Joe had been last night. Immediately, Joe began to weep so hard he couldn't even answer the question. And then when he caught his breath, he just tried to light a cigarette, but his hands were shaking too hard to make the lighter even work. And then eventually, he told Swift that he just couldn't believe it. He said he had actually seen Nikki the night before and she was fine. He admitted they had been having some problems. In fact, he had broken up with her the night before because Nikki had another relationship with another man, Robert. And this caught Swift totally off guard. Joe's reaction definitely seemed sincere, but what he was saying, that he had broken up with the victim less than 12 hours before her murder, essentially because he was jealous of another man, was incredibly incriminating. So Swift told Joe to show him his arms. The detective knew that a knife attack often caused injuries to the attacker as well as the victim, and he wanted to see if Joe had any wounds on his hands or arms. Swift felt a surge of adrenaline as Joe began to roll up his sleeves. But when Joe held out his arms and turned his hands up and then down again to show both sides, his skin was completely uninjured. Now, this was not proof that he was innocent, but it certainly did not make him a stronger suspect either. Joe told Swift he did have an alibi, at least for today. He said he'd been right here at work, which was 15 miles away from Nikki's house, all day long. This is where he was, and his co-workers and clients would all confirm it. With this, Swift was getting a sinking feeling that Joe might not be his guy, but to be thorough, he told him he was going to check on the video and also speak to his co-workers to confirm his alibi, and that Joe would have to come to the station to take a polygraph test. Then Joe agreed. Then, right before Swift turned to leave, he remembered a detail from the canvas of Nikki's neighborhood. The unfamiliar black car one neighbor had seen right outside of Nikki's house. And so, Swift paused for a second and then he asked Joe what kind of car he drove. And Joe said he drove a black Toyota. Swift nodded and thanked Joe, and then walked back to his car to drive back to the station. Now, by this point, Joe was not his no. One suspect anymore, but Joe had a black car and also he didn't have an alibi for the night before when he saw Nikki, until he showed up at the barbershop the next morning. There was a gap, and so Swift obviously could not rule him out. The following day was Thursday, January 14th, and Swift began the day at his desk, drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee and reading through a stack of papers. So far, he had one good theory about a love triangle that he thought was viable, but he also knew he wanted to keep an open mind about other possible ideas and suspects while he chased down the love triangle angle. The first packet of papers he was looking at were documents from the ongoing custody case of Tas and Jas. Over the last few years, from looking them over, Swift was quite interested to learn that the twins' great-grandmother, Della Fraser, who at one point had looked after the girls, had been very upset when Nikki had regained custody. At least in part because it meant Della would no longer receive money from the state for their care. Custody disputes and money were both reasons people killed each other. Swift knew this, but Della was 75 years old. Nikki's attacker would have had to be very strong with good stamina to stab Nikki that many times, so it didn't feel promising that Della was behind the murder. The second packet of papers that Swift was looking over that morning was the autopsy report. Nikki had been stabbed somewhere between 50 and 80 times, and her spinal cord had been severed. However, while that did give some information, it didn't really give Swift much more than he already knew. I mean, he just looked at the crime scene and knew this was a vicious attack, and the autopsy basically confirmed that. Finally, Swift had a few reports from the uniformed officers who had done the neighborhood canvass. They talked about the mysterious black car that had been spotted that at this point Swift was thinking might belong to Joe Carter, the second boyfriend. But the uniformed officers also listed information about another mysterious car neighbors had seen. This one was a Reed sedan, specifically a Dodge Avenger that had a white hood and missing hubcaps. And apparently it had shown up in the early afternoon outside of Nikki's house. No one saw the driver, and it only stayed for a few minutes. As Swift mulled over all this information he was taking in, the phone on his desk rang. When he answered, he was pleasantly surprised to hear the voice of Nikki's living boyfriend, Robert Head, the guy nobody could find. Robert apologized profusely for being so hard to reach and then asked, what's going on? When Swift told him that his girlfriend had been murdered, Robert let out this awful, anguished scream, and then he said he would head home right away. But Swift told him no, just come to the police station. Before Robert hung up, he said he had one more question. How are Tas and Jas? To Swift, Robert's reaction to the news was fairly genuine, and his immediate concern for the girls did sound fatherly, which was how the girls had described him. But Swift also knew the man could be acting. When Robert arrived at the police station, Swift had him put in an interrogation room where he watched for a few minutes on the surveillance camera before going inside himself. When Swift looked at Robert up close, he looked like a broken man. He was 64 years old and thin, and he was slumped in his seat, looking absolutely miserable. When Swift sat down across from him, he could almost feel Robert's grief from the other side of the table. Robert would turn out to be a very easy interview. He answered all of Swift's questions clearly and fully and didn't shy away from pretty embarrassing details. He said he knew about Joe Carter, and he didn't mind that Nikki was seeing him. Nikki was young and beautiful and outgoing, and Robert felt lucky that she even wanted to be with him at all. He said he was crazy about Nikki and about her girls, and really, he just wanted her to be happy. He admitted to fighting with her the day before she was murdered over her phone call she took from Joe Carter right in front of him, sort of breaking one of the rules. But he said that as soon as he had left and hit the road in his truck, his anger had faded, and he had considered their issue closed. And then, when Swift told Robert to show him his arms, they were uninjured just like Joe's. Finally, Robert's truck itself contained proof that he really could not have been the killer, because it had a GPS tracker inside which put him a full day's drive away from the home by the time Nikki was killed. Swift ultimately left that interview feeling totally deflated. In a matter of just 24 hours, he'd identified the seemingly very good suspects in Robert and Joe, but now both of those cases seemed to be falling apart. Over the next few days, Swift tracked down every lead he could, but every lead he had seemed to hit a dead end. The crime scene unit hadn't found the murder weapon, and the crime scene itself was so bloody that forensic DNA evidence would take months to process. Joe Carter, who was Nikki's second boyfriend, passed his lie detector test, which included discussions around his whereabouts the night before the murder, after he had broken up with Nikki at his house. Also, his co-workers the next day at the barbershop confirmed that he had been there all day that day. And on top of that, given the strength of his alibi now, the black car that was seen outside of Nikki's basically couldn't have been his bin. So, Joe was ruled out. Swift interviewed the twins' great-grandmother, Della Fraser, who had been very upset about giving the girls back to Nikki. But even though he didn't think that she literally committed the murder, she did, in fact, have an alibi for the day of the murder. So, she was ruled out as well. Swift even tracked down that red Dodge Avenger with the white hood and missing hubcaps, only to find that it belonged to a hairdressing client of Nikki's who'd stopped by Nikki's house after Nikki had missed her appointment. The woman had left when Nikki didn't answer the door. As the days turned to weeks, the case began to go cold. Meanwhile, Nikki was buried, and the people in the gated community where she had lived began locking their doors at night. The twins, Tas and Jas, were living with Dela again, and Nikki's whole family was pressing the police to come up with an answer. What happened to Nikki? But Swift, despite his best efforts, was running out of ideas. But finally, one day in mid-May of 2010, so almost 4 months after Nikki's murder, Swift got his first piece of good news. He'd walked into the police station that morning to work on a different case altogether, but when he sat down at his desk, he found the forensic reports from Nikki's crime scene. All the blood that had been soaked into the carpet and smeared on the walls had finally been tested for DNA. So had the hair that Swift had found inside of Nikki's mouth. And the results were shocking. When Swift finished reading them, he stood up, walked out of the station, and drove his cruiser to a gas station that was right up the street from Nikki's house. He knew police had not pulled surveillance video from the station because it was too far from the crime scene to be useful, or so they thought. But now, based on the DNA evidence Swift had, he knew that this gas station might be his very best hope to solve the case. When he pulled into the gas station parking lot, he went inside and asked the attendant to speak to the manager. The teenager behind the counter ducked into a back room and then motioned Swift to follow him. Once inside, Swift could barely contain his eagerness as he introduced himself to the manager and then quickly asked if he still had the surveillance footage from the morning of January 13th. This was critical. Swift knew that even if the gas station did have working cameras, the odds of the footage being stored for months were low. But the owner sat down at his computer, clicked around a few files, and then turned to Swift and grinned. He hadn't gotten around to wiping the footage, so everything Swift needed was still here, right in his files. Swift told the manager what specific time frame to search for in the file, and then once the manager had done that, he hit play, and when Swift watched the footage, he knew exactly who had killed Nikki. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of a 4-month investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Whitehead on the morning of January 2010. Nikki's killer was waiting for her in her own kitchen. Nikki heard the killer moving around from inside her bedroom and walked down the hallway to come see who it was. When she first saw the killer, who was there with an accomplice, Nikki actually was not afraid. She was just annoyed. She told the killer and their accomplice to explain themselves. Then, when they refused, she told them to get out of the house. And it was at that point that they attacked. They leapt onto Nikki's back and began to punch her over and over again. Nikki fought back, biting them, and in the struggle, she bit down on a strand of one of their hairs, which got caught in her teeth. The fight moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Nikki briefly broke free. But the killer picked up a red ceramic vase and threw it at Nikki's head. The vase shattered and Nikki staggered, and that's when the killer grabbed a steak knife from a block on the kitchen counter, and they lunged. They began stabbing Nikki over and over and over. As Nikki screamed, panicked and now severely injured, Nikki made one final desperate run for safety. She bolted out the front door of her house, and she made it out the front door and down her walkway, all the way over to a neighbor's front door where she rang the bell and began shouting out for help. But her neighbor didn't come, and before she could run to the next house, The killer and their accomplice rushed up behind her and dragged Nikki back inside of her own house without being seen. Back inside, the killer and the accomplice slammed the door, shutting through Nikki up against the wall, where Nikki's braids left a bloody print. Nikki stood for a moment and then crumpled to the floor. And without hesitating, the killer jumped on Nikki and stabbed her again, over and over until she was dead. After that, the killer and the accomplice dragged Nikki's lifeless body down the hallway and into the bathroom. They ran the water in the tub and then heaved Nikki's body up and over the edge. It was done. They stood there for a minute, just staring down at their work. After that, they cleaned themselves up and then put on their backpacks, slipped out the front door, and began their walk to school. And one of the first buildings they would have to pass on their walk to school was the gas station. And the gas station would have a surveillance camera that would capture them walking to full hours later than what they would tell police. It would turn out Nikki's killers were her own 16-year-old twin daughters, Tas and Jas Whitehead. The twins had told police that they didn't see their mother that morning, but that was a lie. They had gotten up late and instead of going to school, they had been writing notes to each other, unlaughing in the kitchen when Nikki had woken up, come in, and asked why they weren't at school. Tas and Jas were already furious to be back home. They didn't want to be there. They resented their mother and all her strict rules. And for whatever reason, that morning when their mom confronted them, it just felt like the final straw. And so they stabbed her to death and then went to school like it was just another day. When they got home, they put on this big act of being distraught and horrified by the violent scene they themselves had created, and then ran outside to go tell police. But what the twins didn't realize was that during the vicious attack, one of them got a strand of their hair caught in Nikki's teeth, and then also their own blood mingled with Nikki's. Because Tas and Jas were identical twins, the police were never actually able to pinpoint which of them did what, but it was very clear they were directly involved in the killing. Also, after this DNA report came back and Swift treated, it prompted him to go to that gas station, which he knew would have been along the walk to the girls' school, and he quickly discovered they had lied to him about what time they had actually walked to school. Also, it was later determined that some of those bite marks on the girls' bodies that police had originally assumed the girls had made themselves out of grief were actually made by their mother during the attack. But the final, and perhaps most cold-blooded piece of evidence, were the notes the girls had written to each other in their notebook on the morning of the murder. Literally, they wrote these right before they killed their mom. One twin wrote on the last page of the notebook, quote, "She don't care. She's selfish. She needs to go." And the other twin wrote their response, which was, quote, "That's what I think also. She gotta go ASAP." On May 21st, 2010, Tas and Jas Whitehead were arrested for the murder of their mother, Nikki. They ultimately pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Both twins blamed Nikki for starting the fight and said that she actually attacked them. However, officials do not believe this account. On a cold winter night in 1999, a man drove down a dark street towards his house in a small Iowa town. As he was driving, suddenly he saw something glowing in his headlights, and he slammed on the brakes. He got out of his car, and there in the lights, he saw a dog standing all by herself, and she was making this soft, squeaking sound, like she was scared. The man slowly approached her, doing his best to keep her calm as he got close. He knew everybody who lived in this neighborhood, and he had never seen this dog before. He finally reached the dog, and she seemed very scared, and he petted her a couple of times and, still tried to keep her very calm. And as he looked her over, she didn't seem hurt, and she also didn't have any tags on her. The man looked up and noticed he was actually right near his house, and so he decided he would just lead the dog to his house and figure out what to do with her after that. So he coaxed her, and she followed him right along, and they went inside his home. And over the next few weeks, the man would do his best to try to locate her owner, not realizing that this dog had not just wandered off. In reality, this dog would become the key that police desperately needed to solve a gruesome crime. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sign up for as many telemarketing calls as you possibly can. But don't use your phone number. Use the follow button's phone number. Okay, let's get into today's story. On January 20th, 1999, 28-year-old John HELBLE sat at a table in his trailer home in the small town of North Liberty, Iowa, staring down at a gun. But this was not just any gun. This was a classic old revolver from the 1952s that had seen better days. And so, John was intent on restoring it to its former glory. So he picked up a gunsmith screwdriver, which is a small screwdriver with a hollow ground tip, and slowly began taking pieces of the revolver apart. Then, once he had done that, he began cleaning the pieces and removing rust that had collected over the years. John knew restoring a gun like this, at least restoring it the right way, would be slow, painstaking work. And that's actually one of the reasons he loved doing it so much. John had a collection of over 40 classic and customized guns, and when he was working on them, it felt like the rest of the world just disappeared. Somebody could be in the room with him, and he'd forget they were even there. That's how focused he'd become on restoration projects. And staying focused had not always been easy for John. Not long after he had graduated high school and enrolled in college about 10 years earlier, John had gotten involved with drugs, both as a user and also as a dealer. He was frenetic and all over the place, and so drugs had just caused him a lot of problems. He'd had run-ins with the police, and he'd struggled to hold down a job. But over the last couple of years, he'd really tried to make some changes in his life, and that's where restoring uncustomizing guns came in. It wasn't really about selling them for money. Instead, it was about having an interest in something that he was really good at and also that helped him stay calm. It was also something he could do entirely by himself, and John loved being on his own to the point that some people called him a recluse. He had a small circle of friends and family, but he was known to go days at a time without seeing or calling any of them. Back at the table in his trailer, John looked down at the work that he'd already done on this revolver and he smiled. It would still take him several more hours, maybe even another full day, to get the gun looking as good as new, but he could already see a huge difference. Still, he figured it was time to stop for now, because he heard his dog, a 3-year-old black and white Siberian husky mix named Keisha, barking from the front room of the trailer. That meant she wanted food, and as far as John was concerned, whatever Keisha wanted, she got. John stood up carefully, put the pieces of the gun back in its case, and went to the sink to wash his hands. Then he poured some dog food into a bowl on the floor and Keisha came running, and John crouched down, scratching behind her ears and talking to her like she was his best friend. Because in reality, she was. In fact, everyone who knew John said he treated Keisha like she was his child. She went with him almost everywhere he went when he left the house. And there were long stretches of time when Keisha was actually the only other living thing that John interacted with. As Keisha ate the food in her bowl, John walked over to a small refrigerator and grabbed a slice of cold pizza. He ripped off a small piece of it, and immediately Keisha turned from her bowl, jumped on top of him, and devoured the human food that John always gave her as an extra treat. When Keisha was done eating the pizza, John walked to a small room at the back of his trailer. This is where he kept his gun collection in several different gun boxes. He opened up a polished wooden box looking for a spot to put his current project when it was done, and as soon as he did, his face just lit up because in this box he saw his prized possession, a Colt .45 Gold Cup semi-automatic pistol. This was a high-end weapon known for its accuracy and very unique design, and John had customized it further with gold screws and gold flourishes. And he was very proud of the work he had done. Other than his dog and his mom, John said this gun was maybe the most important thing to him in the whole world. John closed the gun box, excited he'd be adding a new piece to the collection soon. Later that night, after taking Keisha for a walk, John sat down at his recliner in the cramped front room of the trailer, and Keisha immediately curled up at his feet. John turned on the TV and it didn't take long before he had drifted off to sleep. And a few minutes later, he was already sleeping so deeply that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps creaking slowly across the trailer floor. On February 23rd, 1999, so third eye for days after John had fallen asleep watching TV, Detective Douglas Vaughn of the Johnson County Sheriff's Department got a call when he was at his desk. Detective Vaughn heard a woman's voice on the other end, and he could tell right away that she was quite upset. Vaughn asked her how he could help, and the woman told him that she was concerned because she hadn't seen or heard from her son, John A. She in over a month. This took Detective Vaughn by surprise. He assumed John's mom was calling to file a missing persons report, but people usually did that when they hadn't heard from a loved one in maybe a few days at the most. So he asked John's mom why she had waited so long to call, and she told him that her son liked keeping to himself. And in fact, it really wasn't unusual for him to go, a week, even to at a time without talking to any of his friends or family. But now it had been over a month, and she had called him several times and she hadn't heard back. But she told the detective that she actually did not want to file a missing persons report. Instead, she was hoping the police would meet her at John's trailer to basically go check on him and make sure he was okay. She just had sort of a sinking feeling about this and didn't want to go in there alone. I mean, she figured her son was probably fine, but she just wanted to know for sure, and she just wanted some other people there with her. Vaughn said that was fine. Then he got the address of the trailer and told her he would meet her there. After that, Vaughn hung up and headed out to his car with the deputy, and as he began to drive, the detective thought to himself that no matter what John's mom had said about her son very likely being fine, well, if she's asked the police to join her at the trailer to go inside and take a look, that actually indicates that she must be really worried. A few minutes later, Detective Vaughn and the deputy drove through North Liberty's downtown, and it looked like something from another time. Like the shops and restaurants lining the main road had been there forever. Vaughn drove a couple more miles past a stretch of farmland and soon arrived at the Holiday Mobile Home Park that had over 200 trailer homes spread out across acres of land. Vaughn headed down a dirt road through the park that had snow piled up on either side, and after a few minutes, he and the deputy arrived at John's trailer. And right away, they saw John's mom along with a mobile home park employee waiting for them. They also saw a blue van parked on the dirt drive in front of the trailer. The officers stepped outside of the car. Vaughn thought it was cold, but nothing too bad. It was sort of a typical Iowa winter day with temperatures a bit over 20 degrees Fahrenheit. John's mom introduced herself and told the detective that she and this employee had actually already tried opening the door, but they found it was locked, and also nobody was responding from the inside. And Vaughn told them, "Okay, stand back so I can break the door down." But John's mom asked him not to do that. If John really was fine, she didn't want to damage his trailer for nothing. At that point, the employee pointed the officers to a window on John's trailer that would be large enough for them to climb through. Vaughn put on his gloves and checked the window, and he found it was locked, but it was pretty flimsy, and so he managed to pull it open without doing any damage and without much trouble. But as soon as the window was open, Vaughn instantly threw his hands up over his nose and mouth to block the horrific smell coming from the inside. He stepped back and caught his breath and then told John's mom not to come over there. Then Vaughn and the deputy kind of braced themselves and went forward and climbed in through the window. Once they got inside, the smell got 10 times worse, and they also immediately saw something strange. In the front room of the trailer, there in the recliner, something large had been completely covered by a blanket. Vaughn held his breath and slowly approached the recliner. He reached out and pulled down the blanket, and right away he kind of flinched. Vaughn was an experienced cop, but he'd never seen anything like this. Sitting upright in the chair was the body of a dead man that had already clearly begun to decompose. However, as gruesome as it was, the man did not appear to have any injuries. It sort of looked like he had fallen asleep and just never woken up again. But as Vaughn walked around the recliner and leaned in closer to the body to get a better look, it quickly became clear that this man had not died of natural causes because Vaughn noticed 2 small bullet wounds. The detective and the deputy left the recliner and made their way through the few other rooms of the trailer. There was a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small room at the back. But after searching those areas, they didn't really find anything out of the ordinary. The home had not been ransacked, and there was no sign of forced entry or a struggle of any kind. The only thing Vaughn thought was odd was that there were odd bowls for food and water on the kitchen floor, but no dog, dead or alive. Vaughn called into the sheriff's department and arranged for a county forensics team to come out. He said he had no idea how long the victim had been dead for, but based on the smell and the decomposition of the body, he figured it had been at least a few weeks. After that, Vaughn prepared himself for what he considered to be the worst part of his job. He was pretty sure the dead man on the recliner was John Helble, but now he needed John's mother to wood the body. Minutes later, John's mother stood in the trailer fighting back tears. She said that was definitely her son in the recliner. She kept her composure, and in a quiet voice, she told Detective Vaughn that she wanted to do whatever she could to help the police. She said outright that John had not always been perfect. He struggled with drugs and had run-ins with the law, but he was a good person and he always tried to help the people he loved. Vaughn told her he would do everything that he could to bring her and her son justice. He also told her that he knew how difficult it was for her to be here in this trailer right now, but he needed to know if there was anything in the trailer that looked sort of out of place to her, and John's mom didn't hesitate. She said John's dog, Prussia, was missing, and that he loved that dog possibly more than anything else in the world. The deputy took notes on Keisha's breed and appearance. Then Detective Vaughn walked with John's mom through the trailer and asked if there was anything else that stood out. John's mom went through the kitchen and into the small back room, and after looking around for a moment, she turned to Vaughn and said something else was off here. Somebody had robbed John of his entire gun collection, which was very valuable. Vaughn asked if there was a chance that John had maybe just sold all of his guns since the last time she had seen him, but John's mom shook her head. She said even if he had sold the collection, there was one gun he would never get rid of, his customized Colt .45 Gold Cub pistol. She told Vaughn that John would sometimes say if anybody wanted that gun, they would have to pry it from his cold, dead hands. Later that day, the county forensics team arrived and began collecting blood samples and fingerprints from the trailer. While that was going on, Detective Vaughn and the deputy searched John's blue van out front, but the only thing they found inside was a dog leash. The detective didn't know if this meant that John had taken Keisha somewhere before he got killed, or if he simply just kept a leash in his van. Then Vaughn and the deputy made their way around the mobile home park and began speaking to John's closest neighbors, but none of them remembered hearing gunshots or anything out of the ordinary over the past few weeks. And they all basically said the same thing. John was a nice guy, but he mostly kept to himself. And so at this point, Detective Vaughn didn't really have much to go on to start this investigation in earnest. He basically needed to wait for the forensics report or the autopsy to get something concrete. And so while he waited for those things, he just hoped that Keisha would turn up. On Friday, February 26th, so 3 days after John's body was discovered, Keisha had still not shown up. However, Vaughn did now have a copy of the autopsy and the forensic report. Unfortunately, though, neither of them gave him very much to go on. The autopsy concluded that John had been killed with a .22 caliber pistol, and Vaughn knew that a lot of 22 seconds don't make very much noise, so that could explain why none of the neighbors heard anything. And then, because of the level of decomposition of John's body, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact date of death, but he believed John had been dead for over a month. And beyond the blood samples from John's wounds and small amounts of blood on the recliner, the forensics team had not found much else. So Vaughn had a crime scene with very little concrete evidence, where the door had been locked, yet there were no signs of struggle or forced entry, and John's beloved dog and his gun collection were missing. All of this led Vaughn to believe that John had likely been killed by someone he was close with, close enough that he would welcome them into his trailer and would have known about the gun collection. However, everyone the detective had spoken to said John basically didn't have friends. He was a loner. And so at this point, Vaughn knew this was not going to be an easy case. And also, North Liberty, Iowa, was a small town with a population of just over 5,000 people. And so a murder in such a small town like that could quickly lead to massive panic in the community, which meant there was going to be a lot of pressure to find a way to solve this difficult case very quickly. But as Vaughn sat there, getting more and more frustrated thinking about this case, a deputy rushed over to his desk. and this young officer had a really excited look on his face. He told Detective Vaughn that he was almost positive he had just found John's dog, Conyers. Vaughn didn't waste any time. He got the location of the dog from the deputy, and then he called John's mother and asked her to go meet him at that location. Vaughn headed out to his car and sped across town to a house in a small neighborhood just a few miles from John's trailer. John's mom arrived soon after, and the two of them went to meet with the man who lived in the house. As soon as they stepped inside, an excited black and white Siberian Husky mix rushed over and greeted John's mom. John's mom petted the dog and got tears in her eyes and said yes, this was definitely Keisha. Detective Vaughn asked the man how he had come to find Keisha, and the man told him he actually found Keisha over a month ago. It was after midnight on January 21st. He said he remembered this specific date because the whole thing was just so odd. He said he had come home that night and saw the dog standing in the middle of the street right near his house. The dog didn't have any tags, and the man didn't recognize her from the neighborhood. But what had really stood out to him was that the dog, despite being out in the elements, was totally clean, like immaculately clean. This seemed really weird to Vaughn too. I mean, it was winter in Iowa. The ground was covered in snow, and the dirt roads outside of town, like where he was describing finding her, were soaking wet and muddy. If Keisha had gotten out of her trailer and wandered a few miles to this location, her fur almost certainly would have been a mess. Now, this story to Vaughn did seem sort of far-fetched, but at the same time, he really had no reason to doubt this guy. I mean, he seemed like he was being very truthful and forthcoming about how this dog came to be in his possession. And so for now, Vaughn decided he would just simply believe him, and he would operate on what this guy was saying. Which meant if this is really how Keisha was found, well then, either John's killer or an accomplice of the killer must have driven Keisha here and left her right here on the street. Otherwise, how else could she be so clean? When Vaughn got back to the sheriff's station later that day, he called the crime lab and told them they had located Keisha. He also said he thought the dog had been driven from John's trailer and dumped sometime early on January 21st. So he now believed John had most likely been killed maybe late on the 20th. The forensics officer we spoke to said that the dog being driven somewhere was actually great news because a dog's nose print is like a human fingerprint. One is unique. So if Vaughn could nail down a suspect, a forensics team could search their car to see if there was any trace of Keisha's nose print on the windows or the interior area. Now, Detective Vaughn felt like finding Keisha was a huge deal for this case, but it was no good if he couldn't track down any viable suspects. I mean, the first thing he did is he contacted the man who had found Keisha, and they searched his car to see if, maybe there were prints inside of his car that suggested he was lying about how he found Keisha. But no, it was totally clean. The guy was incredibly truthful, basically made himself fully available to the investigation, and so he was quickly ruled out. And beyond him, there was nobody in the neighborhood where Keisha had been found that had seen anybody drop her off or had any recollection of seeing a car that looked out of place. It was like nobody knew anything. Keisha had just suddenly appeared. So Vaughn decided to reach out again to everybody he'd already spoken to, John's mom and his neighbors. Vaughn believed that even if John was a recluse, somebody had to know at least one friend of his. And this time, one of John's neighbors did remember something important. The man told Vaughn that he had seen a truck at John's trailer over a month earlier, right around the last time he had seen John. The man was sure that that truck belonged to one of John's few friends, a guy in his 22nd named Mike Harding. And after a quick search through police criminal records, Detective Vaughn discovered that just like John, Mike had a history of using and selling drugs. At the end of February, so a few days after police found John's dog, Keisha, Detective Vaughn sat down with Mike Harding in a small interview room at the sheriff's station. Going into this, Vaughn had no idea what to expect. He knew that Mike had at one point gotten mixed up with drugs and had some trouble with the law in the past, but it really wasn't anything major. It wasn't like Mike was some big-time felon dealer or something. Also, Vaughn had no idea what kind of person someone as reclusive as John would consider a friend. Like, what's Mike gonna be like, he read. But right away, Detective Vaughn felt like Mike was very outgoing and that he wanted to help. Mike said that he and John were close friends, even if they didn't hang out a whole lot. He openly admitted that, yes, they both had issues with drugs and made mistakes in the past, but he said John was a really good guy and he couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. Vaughn asked Mike if he thought it was possible that John might have fallen deeper into the drug scene than Mike maybe realized. Was it possible he'd gotten in trouble with some dangerous people? But Mike said there was no way. Maybe John still smoked weed, but he was not connected to major drug dealers or anything crazy like that. Vaughn thought Mike came off like he was telling the truth, but he'd been a cop long enough to know that some people were just good liars. So he asked if Mike would be willing to take a polygraph test, and Mike didn't hesitate. He said if that would help, he'd happily do it. Before Vaughn wrapped up their interview and took Mike to go take this polygraph test, he said to Mike that he needed to know if there was anybody else he could think of that John might have been hanging out with around the time he was killed back in January. Mike thought about it for a second and then he looked up and said, yeah, there were definitely the people the police needed to speak to. A man named Andy Rich, who'd been John's friend for years, and Andy's girlfriend, Sharon Snyder. Mike said the two of them lived far away in Wyoming now, but they had come to visit John back in January. And Mike said he had not seen or heard from John since the two of them had left. In early March, so just a few days after his interview with Mike, Detective Vaughn left the small town of North Liberty, Iowa, and flew about 1,000 miles away to another small town called Grable, Wyoming. And after meeting with local police there, Vaughn caught a huge break. Local police were already in the process of securing a search warrant for Andy and his girlfriend's residence connected to an unrelated drug investigation. So, after they got that warrant, which was very quick, Vaughn simply accompanied them when they executed the search on the residence. And as soon as the door opened up, Vaughn got a look at Andy and Sharon, and the first thing he noticed was that they seemed a lot older than John. John was 28, and Andy and Sharon appeared to at least be in their 40s. He could also tell that they were totally panicked by the police being there. As the search was going on, Vaughn pulled Andy and Sharon aside and began speaking to them. And during this conversation, Andy would tell Vaughn that, yes, he and Sharon had driven to Iowa back in January, and that he, Andy, had visited John on his own after dropping Sharon off at another friend's house in a nearby town. Andy said that he and his buddy John just hung out for a little while, and then Andy had left, picked up Sharon, and then the two of them had driven back to Wyoming together. Sharon would reiterate the same story, but the whole time they were talking, what Vaughn really noticed about this couple is that they both seemed incredibly nervous. They couldn't stay still and they kept darting their eyes away from Vaughn, kind of all around the house, like they were looking for something. And when police finished up their search, Vaughn understood why the couple was so freaked out, because police found inside of their residence a substantial stash of methamphetamine and marijuana. And more importantly to Vaughn, they also found bullets for a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber gun used to murder John. The local police began to deal with the drugs they had found. They also bagged up those bullets so they could run some more tests on them to determine if they were the same kind of .22 caliber rounds that had killed John. Detective Vaughn did not have enough evidence yet to try to extradite Andy and Sharon back to Iowa, but he now considered the couple his primary suspects. And just as the police were finishing up inside of the house, a forensic tech came inside and called to Vaughn to come outside and look at something. Vaughn followed the tech outside to Andy and Sharon's car that was parked right out in front, and the tech led him to one of the back windows and pointed to a faint smudge. Vaughn asked what he was looking at, and the tech said that this smudge was clearly a dog's nose print. Vaughn got excited. As strange as it seemed, he felt like this dog's nose print could be the piece of evidence that would solve this case. It could be Keisha's nose print. The tech said he would pull the print and test it to see if it really was Keisha's. And Vaughn felt positive that if the prints were a match, he could prove that either Andy, Sharon, or both of them had driven Keisha on the night of the murder and dropped her off where she was found. And Vaughn was sure whoever had driven Keisha on that night had also killed John. The following day, Detective Vaughn was back in Iowa feeling confident that his trip to Wyoming would soon pay off in a huge way. But over the next several weeks, as test results started to come in from the crime lab in Wyoming, any excitement he had felt had quickly disappeared. because the bullets that had been found at Andy and Sharon's place did not match the type of bullets that had killed John. They were the same caliber, but a totally different design. On top of that, the dog's nose print taken from Andy and Sharon's car window was not as complete as they had hoped, so the lab couldn't say one way or the other if it actually matched Keisha's nose. And then also, John's friend Mike had passed his polygraph test. Vaughn knew polygraphs were by no means 100% accurate, but all of a sudden, it was like Vaughn was back to having no clear-cut evidence that pointed to anyone. Vaughn continued to try to track down anybody else who might have been close to John or who could at least point him in the right direction. But what everybody had already said about John proved to be true. He just wasn't that close to very many people. While Vaughn had hoped John's beloved dog, Keisha, might be the key to solving this case, he now felt like he had to try going in a totally new direction. So he decided to focus on the one thing other than Keisha and his mother that everybody said John truly loved, and that was his customized Colt .45 Gold Cup pistol. Since John had added his own specific touches to this gun, like the gold screws and the gold accents, Vaughn hoped that would make it easier to track it down because it was very unique. And so, Vaughn reached out to numerous law enforcement agencies, local, state, and federal, along with gun stores and pawn shops all across the country in the hope that somebody would have spotted this prized gun. But this extensive search came up empty. So Vaughn spent several weeks just kind of retracing his steps all over again. He went back to the crime scene and looked around there, and he also re-interviewed all of his main suspects. He spoke to the guy who had found Keisha. He spoke to Mike in Iowa, and he even returned to Wyoming to speak to Andy and Sharon again. But nothing new developed. Soon, months had passed by without any more evidence, leads, or suspects materializing. And since Detective Vaughn worked in a very small department and he was one of the very few detectives, his time and focus were quickly needed for other investigations. But Vaughn never fully abandoned John's case, and he continued to search for the gold-accented gun, but it just no longer could be his only priority. And over time, despite his efforts, Vaughn began to worry that John's murder might never be solved. Fast forward to late December of 2000, almost 2 years after John's murder, Detective Vaughn's at his desk working a totally different case. Then Vaughn's phone rang, and when he answered, he heard another detective from another city on the line. At first, Vaughn didn't think much of this. Detectives from different jurisdictions often helped each other if they had cases that might be connected. But as this detective spoke, Vaughn almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. Because the other detective said he had just busted somebody for illegally selling guns, and this gun trafficker, over the course of their interview, had brought up pretty adamantly that they knew about this missing gold Colt .45 gun. Now, this detective didn't really know what they were talking about, but they had looked into it and discovered that Detective Vaughn was in the middle of looking into a murder case that involved a missing gold Colt .45, so he was calling about it. The two detectives spoke for a bit longer about this gun, and then after Vaughn hung up, he felt the type of rush he only felt when he knew he was close to solving a case. The following day, Detective Vaughn and the detective who had called him about this gun sat across from the gun trafficker inside of a cramped interview room in a small police station. Above them, a fluorescent light buzzed in, cast a sickly glow over everything. The room just felt tense, and the gun trafficker kept looking back and forth like somebody outside might be watching or listening. But Vaughn and this other detective did their best to keep things as calm as they could, and they explained that any information that led to a murder getting solved would be greatly appreciated by the police and the courts. The gun trafficker nodded. The message was clear: help the detectives with this murder case and possibly avoid serious jail time for their gun trafficking charges. So, eventually, the gun trafficker gave Vaughn an exact address to visit if he wanted to find this gold Colt .45. And when Vaughn heard this address, he just stared across the table in disbelief. This investigation had started in a little town in Iowa and had already taken him to Wyoming more than once, and now Detective Vaughn had to pack his bags again and fly down to Dallas, Texas. A few days later, Vaughn and several members of the Dallas Police Department went to the address Vaughn had gotten from the gun trafficker, and there they met with the man who had supposedly purchased this gold Colt .45 gun. The man was cooperative, but he quickly told them that he actually didn't have the gun anymore. He said he had sold it months ago and had no idea where it was now. After hearing this, Vaughn felt totally defeated, like this trip had been a complete waste of time. But then the man said he actually still had the box that the gold gun had been in when he had bought it. It was a really nice box, so he had kept it for himself. The man went inside and got this box, and when he handed it over, Vaughn looked inside and saw there was a handwritten note. And on this note was a description of the gun that had been sold, and it included all the customizations that had been made to it. And that description absolutely matched John's precious Colt. .45. Vaughn thought maybe he could use a handwriting expert to try to prove John had written this note and that the gun that had been sold to this man in Texas was, in fact, John's gun. But, in truth, Vaughn had really hoped that there would be something more definitive here in Texas to connect this gun's sale directly to John's killer, whoever it was. And as Vaughn was starting to lose hope that any evidence would come from this trip, he decided to look inside of a small ammunition box that was inside of the actual gun box. And at first, once he looked inside of the small ammo box, it didn't look like there was anything useful inside. Just some bullets that may or may not have been used for John's customized guns. But before Vaughn closed the ammunition box, something caught the light, and he stared at it for a second. He waved over another officer, and the two of them just looked at this strange, small object in the bottom corner of this small ammo box. Eventually, Vaughn reached in and just lifted up the small ammo box and held it up to the sun to kind of illuminate it with the light. And when he did, he felt like he had just hit a massive jackpot. Because with this light coming through the box, he could clearly see there was a long strand of white hair tucked inside of this box. And Vaughn felt very confident this hair belonged to a dog. With help from Dallas police, Detective Vaughn collected this piece of hair from the ammunition box and shipped it directly to a woman in California who was one of the few veterinary forensic experts in the country. Using this sample, she was able to run a series of tests, and she determined there was a strong chance that the hair that was found was from the same type of Siberian Husky mix as John's dog, Keisha. As far as Vaughn was concerned, there was no way this was just a big coincidence. So after getting those results, he was sure that whoever had sold the gun to the man in Dallas was the same person who had dropped off Keisha in the neighborhood where she had been found. And armed with this new evidence, Detective Vaughn and his team tracked down the person who had sold the gun in Texas. And after 2 years, they finally knew who had killed John. Based on the dog hair tests, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to John Helble on the night he was killed, January 20th, 1999. The killer stood just inside of the trailer near the front door. Even inside, they could still feel the cold winter air coming through the thin walls. On the other side of the room, in the flickering light of the TV, they saw John fast asleep in his recliner with his beloved dog, Keisha, curled up at his feet. And John and Keisha were facing the killer. The killer, as slowly as they could, reached down and pulled out a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband. After making sure John and the dog had not woken up, the killer began to walk slowly towards John. But after taking a few steps, the floor underneath the killer began to creak, and the killer froze, worried that John might have woken up. But as he stared at John and the dog, neither moved. They were still sleeping. After taking another steady breath, the killer continued to move all the way up to the recliner and then around to the back behind John. There, the killer raised their gun, placed it right at the back of John's head, and then fired. Blood rushed out of the small wound as John's head slumped forward and rolled to the side. But the killer fired into the back of John's head one more time just to be sure he was dead. And John did die right there in his recliner. The killer began to walk back around the chair, but now Keisha was awake and she was growling. The killer tried to calm the dog down, but she began barking, and the more the killer tried to keep her quiet, the louder Keisha got. The killer thought about shooting the dog, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. Instead, they put the gun back in their waistband, rushed to the kitchen, and grabbed the dog leash that was laying on the counter. The killer then put the leash on Keisha, grabbed John's keys that were nearby, and led the dog out to John's blue van. The killer got Kosha into the van, then climbed into the driver's seat and sped out of the mobile home park. A few minutes later, they turned onto a dimly lit street in a quiet neighborhood. They scanned the road and it was empty, so the killer climbed out, opened the passenger door, took off Keisha's leash, and let her out into the street. As soon as she was out of the van, the killer got right back in and sped back to John's. Once they got there, the killer rushed inside and dropped the keys on the counter. Then, they grabbed a blanket on the floor in the front room and used it to completely cover John's body. Then they turned off the TV. After that, they made their way into the back room and picked up all the boxes that held John's gun collection and carried them all out to their own car. Finally, they ran back into the trailer, locked the door from the inside, and then rushed out, closing the door behind them. The killer got into their car, drove a few miles, picked up their girlfriend, and then began the 1,000-mile dart to Wyoming. John's friend, Andy Ridge, was his killer. Andy had been visiting with John secretly, waiting for the right time to kill him. And on the night of January 20th, once John had dozed off in his recliner, and he felt that time had come. Andy's motive for killing his friend was he simply wanted John's gun collection. Andy believed he could sell a lot of these guns, especially John's prized gold customized Colt .45 for really good money. So he murdered his friend and dropped him. Detective Vaughn actually suspected Andy and his girlfriend, Sharon, from the moment he met them in Wyoming. Andy had been at John's residence around the time of the murder. The couple had those .22 caliber bullets in their home, and they had that dog's nose print found on the window of their car. But of course, none of that evidence actually panned out, and so Vaughn had nothing tying either of them directly to the murder. But all of that changed almost 2 years later when Vaughn received a call about the gun trafficker who'd gotten busted for selling guns. It would turn out the detective who had called Vaughn was in Wyoming, and the gun trafficker was Andy's girlfriend, Sharon. And Sharon was finally ready to come clean. Vaughn went back to Wyoming to interview Sharon, and she would tell him that she had lied to him during the initial investigation because she was terrified of her boyfriend, Andy. She claimed she had no idea that John was dead when Andy had picked her up at her friend's house in Iowa and they had driven back to Wyoming. But she now admitted that soon after they had gotten home from that trip, and he told her he was now magically in possession of John's favorite guns, the gold Colt .45, and that also Andy was going to be driving down to Texas to meet with a buyer who wanted to buy this gun. And he told Sharon exactly where this buyer lived. By the time Detective Vaughn visited Dallas to go speak to this buyer, he was sure Andy was the murderer. He just needed proof to bolster his case. And that proof came from the dog hair that was found inside of the ammunition box inside of the gun case. Now, Vaughn never actually found John's prized golden gun, but he did have that handwritten note that had been found inside of the gun box. And a handwriting expert would confirm that the writing matched John's. And so, with Sharon's story and the evidence Vaughn found in Texas, he went back to Wyoming and he confronted Andy. And Andy eventually confessed to the murder, simply saying, "I shot John and took his guns." The weapons charges against Sharon got dropped, and she was only given probation for the drugs found inside of her home. Sharon said she was glad that Andy left Keisha alive, but she never actually understood why he'd done it. She said he'd hated that dog, but for some reason, he just couldn't bring himself to harm her. And so, it was that decision that ultimately connected him to the murder. After his confession, Andy took a plea deal and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He was released on parole in 2020. A quick note about our stories: they're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.